Hello, welcome. Today we're going to be going over resistance. This is the end of my Japanese guide, where I own a whole ton of land, which makes it an ideal spot to do a little bit of testing. But first, let's just go over resistance, mechanics, and how it works. So every state that you occupy that is not your core territory has two things, resistance and compliance. Resistance is how much they hate you, compliance is how much they're willing to work with you. As your resistance grows, your chance for resistance activity grows. When you go above 25% resistance, you get a 50% garrison penetration chance. As resistance goes past 50, you take twice the damage to your garrisons. And then when you go over 75%, you start taking active modifiers to your divisions, reducing their speed, disabling strategic redeployment, reducing local supplies, and giving you 30% attrition. When you get to 90% resistance, on average, across all of that country's occupied territories, they will actively rebel, and that country will get all of their territory back that you own. When it comes to resistance, there's different territory managements that can be used. They're typically referred to as laws because that's what they were called before La Resistance. At the top, you have no garrisons. That's just you decide to not garrison the territory. You don't get anything from the territory, and eventually it will rebel from you, but you save all of the equipment and you don't gain any compliance. So this is something you can do when you're playing as the Soviets and you get Eastern Poland. You can decide to not garrison it. So when the Germans take over Eastern Poland, they'll get very high resistance and they'll have zero compliance. That is banned in most multiplayer games, though. Civilian oversight gives you the highest compliance gain for a very small reduction in resistance target. So if we swap Singapore here to civilian oversight, our resistance target will now be 61%. It was previously 31%, which is manageable for what we're doing. Forced labor is the one that gives you a lot of resources, and Singapore has a ton of resources. If we went to civilian oversight and then check in here, we're getting 288 rubber from Singapore. If we swap back to forced labor, and then come back here, we're now getting 617 rubber from Singapore. So forced labor gives you a lot of resources, but it costs you all of your compliance gain and it requires a lot of garrisons. Harsh quotas is the same thing, but for factories. Now, if we hold down control, you can actually see what you gain and what you lose by going through these. So if I go up to martial law, I'll lose 30% local resources, but I'll reduce my resistance target by 10%. I'll also gain 0.025% compliance gain per day and reduce my garrisons needed by 50%. Generally speaking, if you are at peace, you're going to want to be somewhere either at civilian oversight or local police force because you're not going to be getting the occupied is capitulated, occupied is in exile modifiers, which is increasing our resistance target by 30%. If you remove those, then you can remove 30% from forced labor, and then we'd be sitting here. This is what we'd be sitting at, 31% on civilian oversight if we were at peace. But instead of zero compliance gain, we'd be getting the base. Now, if you're a democracy, democracies have a special one. So if we go to the UK here, the AI doesn't even know that they're supposed to do this, but they should be on local autonomy. It does not reduce resistance, but it does give you an additional 0.02 compliance gain per day, and that's really big, and it reduces the amount of garrisons you need. Your compliance reduces your resistance target by 1% for every 2 compliance you have. So you want your compliance to be as high as possible if it is feasible. As Japan right now, it's not really feasible for me to gain compliance in like the United States. Because I'm at war with them, because I don't have any compliance to start with, my collaboration government did not finish in time. So I don't have any compliance to start with, so I shouldn't really worry about compliance. Because if I swap California to civilian oversight, their resistance target is going to be 66%. That's way too high. Even military governor is going to have them at 36% with a minuscule compliance growth. The game is going to be over before that compliance ticks up to anything worthwhile. So I'm just going to sit at martial law. California does have a good amount of resources and factories, so if you needed those, you could use either harsh quotas or forced labor. Fascist specific one is brutal oppression. This allows you to quickly reduce your resistance because it doubles resistance decay. So if you had a state with a really high resistance, like let's say you take over a state and it's got 60% resistance. So right now in Germany, if Germany wanted to get this resistance target down really quickly, they could swap to brutal oppression temporarily, get it down, and then go back to martial law. Communists also have their own specific one as well. It's liberated workers. It is about the halfway point between local police force and civilian oversight. It requires way more garrisons, 30% more than civilian oversight, but it does give you 20% of local factories and 30% of local resources, which is really nice. The other reason you want compliance is because the more compliance you have, the more local resources, local non-core manpower, and local factories you will get. This is the power of doing a collaboration government. I did 2 on China before I capitulated them, and that got me to 75%, and it's been growing since then. Anyways, let's move on to divisions. Currently, I'm just using a basic 12 width. I don't have support companies, so the size doesn't matter. I just took the one support company off this, and then I was using this. I've also disabled infantry equipment 2 and infantry equipment 3, so I just use the captured stuff I have. So if we go into our equipment details, we are using largely infantry equipment 1. If you run out of infantry equipment 1 that's allowed to use, it will pull in infantry equipment 2 and 3. But by disallowing that, it'll primarily use infantry equipment 1. This is one of the ideas. You just don't do military police at any point in time. You just use a single cav. The size doesn't matter because the amount of suppression scales linearly. So you could just, if you don't have an adequate cav division, you can just spend 5 experience and create one. And this division is no better or worse at suppression than this one. The other idea is you add military police. If you're going to add military police, this gives you a percent modifier. So this is 1939 military police. It's going to give you a suppression bonus of 30%. So if we make this save, as you can see, it'll cost us 848 support equipment. It'll save us 15,000 infantry equipment and 110,000 manpower. That seems really worthwhile if you're willing to do the research and you have the additional support equipment. Now, if you're going to do this, you're going to want to make this cav division as big as possible to reduce your support company needs, which means you should come in here and you should do proper heritage. It costs 35 army experience, and when you do that, you can increase the size of this division for free. So I can just make this division a 50 width. So we started as a 12 width, we're now a 50 width, which means I added 19 divisions, which is 95 army experience, but it's going to cost me 0. So that is a savings of 60 army experience to start with. And clicking that button did nothing. There was no changes clicking that button because I didn't add the support companies. It's not actually 65 because if you're going to want actual bonuses from your middle and you're going to want to swap to, let's say you want to swap the tip of the spear, that's going to cost you another 35. So my actual savings was only 25 army experience. But that's still 25 army experience. Now, if we add on military police to this division, we're going to need 203 support equipment. And instead of saving 15,000 infantry equipment, we're now saving 17.5 thousand. And instead of saving about 100,000 manpower, we're saving 142,000 manpower. So if you're going to use military police, bigger division is better. So that's one of the ways you can suppress. The other way you can do it is either using light tanks or armored cars. If we went to light tanks, we would save ourselves 305,000 manpower. It'd cost us 24,000 light tanks, but save us 60,000 infantry equipment. This statement would also be true if we swapped to armored cars. Everything's the same. Armored cars and light tanks have the same suppression value. Now, why would you use these? The hardness value. The armored cars I have researched right now would give us 65% hardness. If we swap to light tanks, and I'll show you the light tank design we should be using in just a bit, we now have 80% hardness. Resistance activity is soft attack. That's how it's treated. It's treated as soft attack. So by having 80% hardness, we're only going to take 20% damage. Now, which should you use, armored cars or light tanks, if you're going to spend the IC? Because you got to remember, with our initial cav division, this division for me is free. Because I have conquered so much territory, I've captured so much enemy equipment, that division has 0 IC cost for me because all I'm using is captured equipment. And that's going to be largely true for any world conquest run. As you start eating small countries and you start getting 10 to 30,000 equipment for each one, just capitulating that country is going to pay for the resistance if you use cav. Let's go into what tank you should be using for your resistance purposes. You want the heavy machine gun is the cheapest gun. You want a one-man turret is the cheapest turret. You do actually want bogey suspension. You do not want to go down to wheeled suspension because that reduces your hardness. You can go for diesel, gasoline, it doesn't matter, and then you're going to want to stay with riveted. For one army experience, you can create an interwar light tank that costs 2.4. If we go to armored cars, the interwar armored car costs 4. The interwar armored car is way more expensive. 4 IC versus 2.4. If we pull up the calculator, 4 minus 2.4, new minus old over old, is a 66.7% increase in the cost. And if you use interwar tanks, you're likely to capture some other light tanks that would otherwise be useless to you, and they'll be pulled into that division as well. That's just reducing the cost. So I'm going to do 4 tests, and then I'm going to be back. I'm going to test this division without the military police, and then I'm also going to test using the light tanks. How much IC will this cost you over the course of a year? Because this is still expensive. I'm going to go to August 1st, and I'm going to let the game run for a year. And August 1st, 1944, I'm going to come back, and we're going to go into the garrison log, and we're going to see how much equipment we've lost. Anyways, I will do those tests, record the results, and be back. Oh, and there's no point in testing armored cars because they're just worse. Alright, so I've finished the testing and I've gotten the results. We only did this for 1 year, but I have assumed that the losses are going to be about equivalent each year. So I have actually extrapolated this out to 3 years. We can use this to produce two charts. One, the chart for your manpower usage, which shows us that just using cavalry is going to use an insane amount of manpower over time. Just the garrison cost of garrisoning all of this is 790,000 manpower compared to light tanks with military police, which is 261. And then on top of that, you're losing 320,000 manpower a year compared to light tanks only losing 20,000. So when you're going for a world conquest, you're going to be using a lot of manpower just garrisoning all of your stuff if you're using cavalry. And if you're going to use cavalry, you're definitely going to want to use military police because this is about a difference of 400,000 manpower, which is not insignificant. If we move on to IC, we'll see light tanks lose less IC. Surprisingly, light tanks without military police actually lose less IC than light tanks with military police. And you can actually see the same thing with cavalry versus cavalry with military police. The military police are going to reduce your initial cost, but they're going to increase the amount you lose over time because support equipment is really expensive. Support equipment is 8 times more expensive than infantry equipment. And even within light tanks, support equipment costs 4 IC versus tanks costing 2.4. The manpower gain from using military police for light tanks is not very significant, but that initial IC cost is. You're saving yourself 20,000 IC by using military police. However, building this division, if you didn't go mobile warfare, is going to cost you 135 army experience versus this division, which will cost you 5. Now, after 3 years, they reach about the same amount of losses. And at this point, cavalry and cavalry with military police are starting to trend towards that same point. If we expand out the IC costs for 1 extra year up to year 4, you'll see that 25 manpower, that 25 cav plus military police is actually still slightly lower than everyone else. And you're actually at the point where it's going to cost you less IC if you're just using light tanks over light tanks plus MP. But that's 4 years out. What you really care about is this first 1 to 2 year part. It is so much cheaper to set up the cavalry division needed to actually do the resistance suppression because a lot of this IC that you're using is actually going to be free. This is going to be IC that you've acquired from capitulating countries, and you're just going to be using their guns that you got from capitulating them. Versus these light tanks, you're going to have to build them yourselves. You might get a couple from other countries, but nowhere near the amount of guns. If you're going to do that, you're going to want military police. Another thing I didn't mention earlier is in these territories like China, where I have 90% compliance, I don't need to be using these expensive divisions. I could swap from this division to the cav division, and it's going to cost me nothing because the resistance is below 0. When we actually go into these states, there is 0 chance of resistance actually doing anything. So if you actually went through and microed this and swapped all of these states that have very high compliance and 0 resistance, you could substantially bring down that starting cost. And then you can save your light tanks for high resistance countries. So just use it on the countries like British Malaya, where I'm using forced labor, and Australia, and the countries that you didn't manage to get collaboration governments on, where you're going to have high resistance. You're going to be taking a good amount of damage from your resistance. Another thing I believe I mentioned, but it can help you alleviate the manpower requirements of using cavalry, is requesting garrison support. So I already have 100,000 manpower from these guys, and they're going, no, we don't have any more manpower. Anyways, I hope that clears up any misconceptions about resistance and what you should be using and when you should be using it. If you're doing a world conquest, light tanks might be useful just for the manpower savings. You're going to trade IC for manpower. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys later.